one of the central motifs of Isaiah's ministry is Exodus. In the midst of the heaviness and the darkness and the oppression of his day, he could speak of a God who was an Exodus God, who identified with those who were not experiencing the fullness of life as God, the Creator, intended it to be experienced, and say, I'm coming for you. I've heard the cries of my people. Change is on the horizon. I'm bringing transformation. I'm about to do a new thing, he says, a new Exodus. And I just think in our day right now, when there's so much change, there's so much disorientation, I think we're all experiencing a corporate trauma. And coming out of the context of that, I just feel like we need good news. And Isaiah is the perfect messenger for our moment. The particular word that Israel gets in Isaiah 57 seems to describe a moment in Palestine or Judea when a faithful generation has passed away. Maybe it's a reference to those who had been taken off into exile, Daniel's generation. They've died. And then there's another generation who's in the land. And this generation seems to be the byproduct of two traditions, if you want, the Israelite tradition plus the local cultural tradition. These people who are living in the land at that time, perhaps they're the ones who are welcoming back some of these exiles, seem to have mixed biblical faith with the paganism of the culture around them. And so there's this mixture of language of Israelite piety, offering sacrifices, morning sacrifices, evening sacrifices, mixed in with the language of paganism, child sacrifice and high places and the woods. It's hard to know what's going on. At first blush, you might think that God's people are engaged in full-blown idolatry. But most commentators suggest that it's not that. It's just that they have kind of mixed their faith with the cultural beliefs so that when they worship God, the true God, Israel's covenant partner, it sounds to God as idolatry. This mixed faith, the Lord is deconstructing it in front of their eyes, which is a caution, not to mix what God has said about himself with what we learn from the culture, as though we could somehow have both. And he ultimately speaks a word to them, speaking of them as those who are, now our translations say contrite and humble, but the Hebrew is better to think of it as crushed and humiliated or humbled. He describes a people who end up broken. And rather than saying, well, you're going to get what you deserve, here's the surprise: those who take refuge in me shall be blessed. And I am a God who not only dwells on high in the holy place, but I dwell with those who are crushed and humbled and humiliated. So there's this great there's a warning, and then there's this great promise. The passage sort of begins in Isaiah 57 with a portrayal of death, this generation that seems to have lied down and they experience peace simply because they're dead. But it ends with a promise to make alive, to revive. God says, I will vitalize you. I will bring life to you. Well, in Isaiah's terms, the gospel is a new exodus. And that God acts decisively to liberate God's people, to make them free, to claim them as his own. And so there's an Old Testament gospel that's present in Isaiah, but it points us to Jesus. Isaiah 53 has said that he was bruised. By his wounds we have been healed. We see that same language here. God is saying, I dwell among those who are bruised, those who are crushed. We have a picture of the incarnation of a God who dwells on high, but who comes down to dwell among those of us who are crushed, humiliated by our sin or in our sin. This is a beautiful picture of God taking on human flesh and moving into our humanity, even at our worst, a sinful humanity, a humanity that's compromised and in rebellion against God. I do not abandon you. Even at that point, the Lord says to his people, you're mine, I claim you, I will come among you, and I will revive you. This is a picture of, I will give you life. So we really have a picture of death to life that happens because of God's divine intervention. And that's, of course, what the gospel, as New Testament followers of Jesus Christ, we understand, wow, Paul says in Ephesians 2, you were dead, but God made us alive with him, raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly holy places. And this is what's happening. Frederick Douglass said, there's very little resemblance between the Christianity of Jesus and the Christianity of America. And that was what he saw in that day. We always, all followers of Jesus, have to be open to the possibility that there is a difference between the Christianity of Jesus and the Christianity of my culture. As a white evangelical Christian, this text challenges me to ask, in what ways has my faith in God been mixed with deeply held, maybe even subconsciously held beliefs about myself, about other people, and about God? That's an uncomfortable question for me. And in America, what we know is that we brought African American people over to our continent for our own economic advantage. And in order to do that, we had to tell ourselves that there was a difference in humanity between Europeans or white people and African Americans, or for that matter, the people who were original inhabitants of this land. We had to tell ourselves that somehow we had something better than what they had, and we had therefore a right to upend their world, take their land. Those beliefs got folded into our Christian practice and our Christian theology to such an extent that I don't even think we know the influence of those beliefs on our current faith and practice. The scriptures are what define for us the Christianity of Jesus. And as we live within the story that the scriptures offer us, our culture gets challenged. But it is so much easier to experience that challenge with the help of other cultures. Kindred gives us this opportunity. We kind of bump into other ways of being, other ways of believing. And it opens a little bit of a window where it just raises questions. We go, I wonder if I do what I do just because my culture does what I do and not because Jesus is calling me to it. And so what I want for Kindred to do is to expose us all to difference. And I want questions around difference to be raised, because I think as we go to Jesus and allow him to answer the questions of what are we to do, what are we to believe, and how are we to live, he will start to reshape us. And will call out, I think, the richness and the beauty of all God's children and the fullness of creation, and help us to embody it more in our own city, in our own day. I'm also praying that as we move forward with Kindred, that we would get beyond just thinking about it as a diversity project, that we would go deeper, and that we would be increasing in our capacity to talk about what does justice look like in America for followers of Jesus, and how do we engage in that work with one another. And that's not easy, and I'm not sure I have answers, but I think Jesus does, and he'll lead us through it.